What's one invention that humanity could have done better without? Story 1. I once bought a pair of pants that had fake pockets. Like the seams were there, but they were just for show. My girlfriend laughed at me and said, "Welcome to women's fashion." I didn't get it until I had to carry her phone, keys, wallet, and chapstick in my actual pockets every time we went out. By the end of the night, I looked like a chipmunk storing snacks for winter. Why don't they just give women real pockets? Or at least warn the men they're dating to invest in cargo shorts? Story 2. So, my buddy in England was remodeling his basement when he called me, freaking out. "Mate, I think I've found a bomb." Turns out it was a bomb. A leftover from W2 buried in the walls. He spent the next 12 hours outside with his dog while the bomb squad came to sort it out. All I could think was, imagine trying to sell that house. Charming home, minor risk of unexpected explosions. Story 3. When I was a kid, I used to think landmines were cool because of that game Minesweeper. Then my uncle, who served in Vietnam, sat me down and explained what they actually do. I've never been more horrified. Now, every time I see that stupid smiley face on the game, I feel personally attacked. Thanks, Uncle Mike, for ruining nostalgia and teaching me to fear stepping off sidewalks. Story 4. A buddy of mine once said he had a system for sports betting apps. He'd win a little, lose a little, but kept saying he was breaking even. One night I walked in on him celebrating. "I'm up $500, he shouted. Then I asked how much he'd spent to get there. The smile faded real quick. Turns out he'd spent $1,200 to win that $500. Genius, right? Now he calls it his $700 lesson. Story 5. I once got into an argument with a guy over plastic straws. He said banning them was pointless because we still use so much other plastic. I didn't have a good comeback until later, when I found out his favorite coffee shop switched to paper cups but still gave him 3 plastic lids for his iced latte. Like, dude, we're all just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic at this point. Story 6. We just moved into this old neighborhood in Germany. Quaint streets, cobblestones, the works. They were excavating nearby for some new condos, and we thought it was the perfect chance to get to know the neighbors. Then one day, a construction crew hit something big. The next thing we knew, cops were pounding on doors, shouting something about unexploded ordnance. My German's rusty, but the word bomb came through loud and clear. We packed what we could carry and bolted. Turns out, it was a WW2 bomb buried under the ground for over 70 years. It had just been sitting there, waiting for the right or wrong moment. The worst part? This wasn't some freak occurrence. Stuff like this happens all the time in Europe. People stumble across these things like you'd find an old coin or bottle. It's terrifying to think about how war leaves these ticking time bombs scattered across landscapes and lifetimes, forcing future generations to pay the price for battles they didn't fight. Story 7. My dad was a proud man, a military guy through and through. He'd served in Thailand during the Vietnam War, stationed at Utapao Air Base. For years he told us the U.S. never used chemicals like Agent Orange there, that the base was safe. Turns out that was a lie. He got a call one day from the VA, apologizing for his exposure. Apologizing is a strong word. It felt more like they were covering their butts because the news was about to break. For months, my dad had been loading planes under the glow of chemicals sprayed nightly to clear jungle growth. He didn't know then, but it seeped into his skin, his lungs, his soul. Years later, he got sick. His body deteriorated and his spirit faded. Watching him grapple with the betrayal hurt more than his eventual passing. He'd done what he thought was right, served his country, only to be poisoned by it. And the ripple effects? My siblings and I still show signs of what they call generational effects. It's not just about the past. It's about the poison that keeps spreading long after the war ends. Story 8. I was around 8 when I learned the meaning of fear. My cousin and I were wandering through an old tunnel near San Diego, one of those decrepit spots kids find fascinating. It smelled like rust and mildew, and we kept daring each other to go deeper. Finally, we saw light at the end, and I remember thinking we'd found treasure or a secret hideout. Instead, we stepped out to a giant sun-bleached sign. Warning: active mines in surrounding area. We froze. My cousin whispered, "What's a mine?" I didn't know exactly, but I'd heard my dad talk about them once. Explosives buried underground, waiting to blow. My heart raced as I imagined the ground beneath us packed with bombs. Slowly we turned and crept back through the tunnel, retracing every step like we were diffusing something ourselves. When we made it out, we didn't talk about it, but I couldn't sleep for days. Years later, I learned how widespread the problem really is. Mines aren't just a thing of the past. They're still killing and maiming people today, especially in places like Cambodia, Laos, and Angola. Farmers can't use their land, kids can't play safely, and even animals fall victim. And here's the kicker. Most of these mines were laid decades ago, during wars that ended before these people were born. They weren't meant to just win battles. They were designed to last, to keep hurting long after the fighting stopped. That day in the tunnel stuck with me. It's horrifying to think how easily I could have been one of those stories you hear about, a kid blown apart because someone decided war wasn't deadly enough. Landmines might be small, but their impact is enormous, leaving scars on landscapes and lives for generations. Story 9. I used to think war ended when the last shot was fired, when treaties were signed, and soldiers went home. But that illusion shattered the day they evacuated our block. It was the second time in 2 years that a WW2 bomb was found near our home. The construction crew had been digging a foundation for a new shopping center when their excavator hit something solid. At first, everyone assumed it was just a rock or a piece of old machinery. Then the bomb squad arrived, and we knew it was serious. The evacuation was chaotic, families grabbing essentials, pets howling in carriers, police shouting directions. My neighbor, an older guy named Franz, stood on his porch, watching us with a grim expression. Later, I learned he'd grown up in Germany during the war and still remembered the nights the bombers came. He said these things happened all the time. Unexploded bombs, buried in fields, under roads, even in people's basements. Some were defused safely, others exploded, destroying homes or killing unlucky passers-by. That night, while the experts worked to disarm the bomb, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how it got there, dropped from the sky decades before I was born, and how it had just been sitting there, waiting. It wasn't just about our bomb, either. This happens everywhere. Belgium, Vietnam, Cambodia, places where wars ended, but the explosives stayed behind. I read later that landmines are even worse. They're not accidents of war. They're intentional, scattered like seeds to kill and maim for decades. When I heard the controlled detonation the next morning, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. We'd dodged this one, but how many others were out there waiting to remind us that war never really ends? Story 10. I remember the first time I saw those gambling ads, flashy, full of promises like you'd hit the jackpot just by signing up. Back then it seemed harmless. But then I watched my roommate spiral. He started small, playing on those apps late at night, thinking he'd make an easy buck. At first he was up, free drinks on him, rent paid early. But it didn't last. One night I heard him screaming at his phone. He'd lost everything, and I mean everything. His paycheck, his savings, even the money he'd borrowed. It got darker from there. Payday loans, promises to win it all back, and an eviction notice we both knew was coming. What kills me is how easy these apps make it. You don't need to go to a casino. You can destroy your life from the comfort of your couch. My roommate moved out after that, but I still see those ads everywhere. And every time I think about him and wonder how many others are falling into that same trap. Story 11. Growing up, my mom used to talk about how plastics were the future. She'd tell me how they saved trees, replacing paper in bags, packaging, and more. I believed her, until I didn't. By the time I was old enough to think for myself, our beaches were choked with plastic waste. I remember one summer, volunteering for a cleanup on the coast. We found everything: Plastic straws, bottle caps, fishing nets, even toothbrushes. I'd never seen anything like it. The worst part was when we cut open a dead sea turtle and found its stomach full of the stuff. I'll never forget the smell, the sight of those tiny, colorful bits lodged inside its body. It wasn't just trash, it was a death sentence. Sure, plastic made life convenient, but at what cost? It's not like we don't have alternatives now. Biodegradable options exist, but they're more expensive, so companies stick with what's cheap. And we all pay the price, one way or another. Story 12. When I was a kid, I loved exploring. My cousin and I found this old tunnel near San Diego. It was damp, dark, and smelled like rusted metal. We squeezed through, thinking we'd find treasure or at least something cool. Instead, we popped out on the other side to a giant warning sign. Active mines in surrounding area. I didn't even know what a landmine was back then, but I knew it wasn't good. We froze, staring at the sign, wondering how close we'd come to stepping on one. The idea of being blown apart haunted me for weeks. Later, I learned just how common landmines are, remnants of wars that ended decades ago, still killing people today. Kids in Cambodia, Angola, even Vietnam, places I couldn't find on a map then, lose limbs or worse because someone thought burying explosives in the ground was a good strategy. That day in the tunnel stuck with me. It's a sick kind of luck that I get to tell this story, while others don't get to live theirs. Story 13. I used to think of landmines as some faraway problem, something in history books or documentaries. That changed when I came across a video about rats being trained to sniff out mines. It was almost surreal, watching this little creature with its twitching nose carefully scuttle across a field that could kill it in an instant. These rats were saving lives, but the more I watched, the angrier I got. Why were rats needed in the first place? Because someone thought it was a good idea to scatter explosives everywhere, often without maps or records. These mines don't just vanish when the war ends. They stay buried in fields, forests, even playgrounds, waiting to rip apart whoever is unlucky enough to step on them. And the victims? Most are kids or farmers, people trying to live their lives decades after the fighting stopped. I admire those rats, but the fact they're needed at all is just another reminder of how humanity's worst inventions outlive their creators. Story 14. My dad was a tough guy, the kind who never backed down from a challenge. He was stationed at Utapao Air Base during the Vietnam War, working long, grueling hours loading planes. He used to tell us stories about the heat, the mosquitoes, and the camaraderie among the soldiers. But there was one story he never told: how the base was soaked in Agent Orange. We found out years later when the VA called him out of the blue. They told him he'd been exposed, that the chemicals had been sprayed around the base to keep the jungle at bay. I remember the look on his face when he hung up the phone, like the life had drained out of him. For years he'd believed the government's assurances that they didn't use chemicals like that in Thailand. Turns out, it was a lie. Planes had been circling the base, spraying poison into the air, and my dad had been breathing it in every night. The effects came fast after that call: aches, memory loss, then full-blown organ failure. But what broke him wasn't the sickness. It was the betrayal. He'd served his country, done everything they asked of him, and this was his reward. Worse, the damage didn't stop with him. My siblings and I started showing symptoms, too. Autoimmune disorders, strange allergies, things linked to generational exposure. When my dad passed, it wasn't just his body that died. It was his faith in the system, in the idea that doing the right thing mattered. Sometimes I think about how many others there are like him, carrying the scars of wars they didn't start, with no one to hold accountable. Story 15. Growing up in rural Belgium, I'd always hear stories about the iron harvest, farmers digging up rusted WWI shells during planting season. I never took it seriously until a neighbor down the street lost half his barn to an unexploded bomb. My dad said it was just one of those things, like a thunderstorm or a bad crop year. I didn't get it then, but now, as an adult, I think about how insane that is. 100 years later, people are still living with the fallout of a war they weren't even alive to see. And landmines? They're like a modern-day curse. At least old bombs weren't designed to wait for someone to step on them. With mines, it's deliberate. They were made to maim, to kill, to linger long after the soldiers had left. I think about that barn sometimes, about the crater it left and the fear it spread through our little village. It's not just history, it's still happening all over the world. Story 16. My grandpa used to smoke like a chimney, 3 packs a day, unfiltered. It was normal back then. Everyone did it. Even now I can picture him in his recliner, puffing away while we watched baseball. He'd cough so hard sometimes we thought he'd pass out. But no one ever talked about it. Not until he was diagnosed with lung cancer. He died before I turned 12. Years later I learned about how cigarettes were pushed so hard by big tobacco companies, how they covered up research about their dangers. It made me furious. My grandpa didn't just choose to smoke, he was lied to, manipulated. And it wasn't just him. Millions of people died slow, painful deaths because of an invention that's given us nothing but disease, addiction, and heartbreak. Even now, with all the regulations and warnings, the damage is done. It's baked into our history, into our families. Every time I smell cigarette smoke, I think of him, and it hurts. Story 17. My dad never talked much about his time in the military. He was stationed in Thailand during the Vietnam War, working the night shift at Utapao Air Base. He'd tell us funny stories about the heat or the guys he worked with, but the war itself, silence. That changed the day the VA called. They told him he'd been exposed to Agent Orange. He just sat there for a minute, holding the phone like it was about to explode. Turns out, planes had been spraying the chemical all around the base to clear the jungle. Night after night, my dad had been breathing it in, loading planes while the mist settled over everything. The government swore it wasn't happening, but years later when the truth came out, all they offered was an apology. By then, it was too late. My dad started getting sick, aches that wouldn't go away, trouble breathing. The diagnosis came fast, organ failure, irreversible damage. But it wasn't just his body that suffered. The betrayal hit him harder. He'd answered his country's call, done his duty, and this was his reward, and it didn't stop with him. My siblings and I were affected too, showing symptoms linked to generational exposure, autoimmune issues, strange health problems no one could explain. The anger I felt was unbearable. My dad had been poisoned, and so had we, all because someone decided chemicals were an easy solution. Watching him fade was like watching a part of history crumble. He wasn't just my dad. He was a man who believed in something bigger than himself until that belief was shattered. By the time he passed, I think he'd already given up. And honestly, I don't blame him. What's left to fight for when the people you served have already declared you collateral damage? Story 18. There was a time when social media felt like magic, connecting with old friends, sharing milestones, even meeting new people. But then came the algorithms. At first they were just annoying, ads for stuff I'd never buy, videos I didn't care about. But over time, I realized they weren't just harmless distractions. They were shaping how I thought, how I felt. I'd catch myself doom-scrolling, rage-clicking, falling into rabbit holes of negativity. The worst was seeing my dad, a retired teacher, get sucked into conspiracy theories. He went from calm and thoughtful to angry and paranoid, all because some platform decided outrage was profitable. It's like we handed over our lives to these companies, and they're just wringing every penny out of us, no matter the cost. I've tried to pull away, to detox, but it's hard when everyone else is still plugged in. Sometimes I wonder what life would be like if we'd never invented this stuff at all. Story 19. The first time I saw the Pacific garbage patch, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I wasn't there in person, but the footage was enough. Miles and miles of floating plastic, bottles, bags, straws, all of it. It looked like another planet. I thought about all the times I'd used a plastic straw or tossed out a wrapper without a second thought. I'd never considered where it went, but seeing that massive pile of trash, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The worst part was the microplastics, tiny bits so small they're in our water, our food, even the air we breathe. What started as a convenience turned into a global disaster. And yeah, I get that it's not the plastic itself, it's what we did with it. But that doesn't change the fact that it's everywhere now, poisoning the planet. I've tried to cut back, to use less, but it feels like a drop in an ocean of garbage. Story 20. I used to think of plastic as a miracle material. It was lightweight, cheap, and could be molded into anything. I mean, who didn't grow up with a kitchen drawer full of plastic utensils and Tupperware? But everything changed when I took a trip to Hawaii. My friends and I had planned this getaway to paradise. Pristine beaches, crystal clear water, all that. What we didn't expect was the trash. The first beach we visited looked picture perfect from a distance. But as soon as we got closer, we saw the plastic, tiny shards mixed with the sand, bottles tangled in seaweed, and bits of fishing nets floating in the waves. It wasn't just an eyesore, it was heartbreaking. I'll never forget the moment we found a dead albatross chick. Its belly was bloated with bits of plastic, lighters, bottle caps, things no bird should ever have to eat. We tried to help by joining a cleanup crew. For hours we picked up trash, filling bag after bag, but it felt like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. The real kicker was when one of the locals explained that this wasn't even the worst of it. Most of the plastic was out at sea, in places like the Pacific garbage patch, swirling around in a toxic stew. And the stuff we can't see? Microplastics, breaking down into tiny particles that are now in our water, our food, even our bodies. Since that trip, I've tried to cut back, carrying reusable bags, refusing straws, but it feels futile. Plastic is everywhere and it's not going away. It's easy to blame corporations and they deserve it, but we're all complicit. We took something that could have been a tool for good and turned it into one of the planet's biggest disasters. And now we're stuck with it. Story 21. When my roommate downloaded his first gambling app, he thought it was harmless. Just a little fun. A $10 bet here, $20 there. At first, it seemed like he was winning. He'd come home grinning, waving cash around like he'd cracked some secret code. But then the losses started piling up. I didn't notice at first, but little things gave it away. Late rent payments, unopened bills, and the way he'd sit glued to his phone, muttering under his breath. One night, I walked into the living room and found him yelling at his phone, red-faced and shaking. "I had it," he said. "I was winning, and then—" He didn't finish, but I didn't need him to. The money was gone. He'd lost his paycheck, his savings, and even borrowed money from friends to keep playing. I tried to talk to him, to get him to stop, but he just waved me off. "I can get it back," he said. "One more win and I'm good." It only got worse. Payday loans came next, predatory traps that dug him even deeper. He stopped eating out, then stopped eating much at all. Eventually, the eviction notice came and he moved back in with his parents. I don't know what happened to him after that, but I still think about him whenever I see those ads for gambling apps. They make it look so easy, so fun, like you can't lose. But you can, and you will. The scariest part? You don't even have to leave your house to destroy your life anymore. The casino is in your pocket, ready to take everything you have. And the companies? They don't care. They profit from every broken life, every ruined family. If I could go back, I'd rip that app off his phone the moment I saw it. But I didn't, and now I just hope he's okay wherever he is.